The Historical Geography of the Holy Land, Lesson 13, Hellenistic and Early Roman Periods. The period of the Persian control of the Near East and the Levant came to an end with the campaign of Alexander, son of Philip, king of Macedonia. His conquest of Anatolia, the Levant, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the land of the Persians, up to the border of India, earned him the title Alexander the Great. Alexander's sudden death in 323 resulted in his kingdom being divided among his generals. The Persian satrapy called Beyond the River was now called Syria, or Syria and Phoenicia. It appears as one undivided satrapy and was given on 2 occasions to the same general, Laomedon. In 329, Ptolemy I, Soter, invaded Syria and took the territory away from Laomedon. In the next 20 years, control changed 5 times, in 320, 315, 312, 302, and 301. The Treaty of 311 divided the kingdom into 4 parts: Antigonus over Asia, Lysimachus over Thrace, Ptolemy over Egypt, and Cassander as regent over Macedonia until Alexander, the young son of Alexander the Great, came of age. After the defeat of Antigonus by Seleucus and Lysimachus, Ptolemy moved into southern Syria. This had been given to Seleucus, but Ptolemy was there. And this remained a problem for these 2 kingdoms for over 100 years. In the beginning of the Hellenistic period, there was no substantial change in the Levant made by Alexander. But the country changed hands several times in the wars between Alexander's successors. Ptolemaic rule was reestablished in the Levant in 301. Ptolemy's policy was to preserve the rule in Egypt against the rival Hellenistic powers of Macedonia and Syria. He needed the Levant as a buffer state to protect the eastern approach. The whole area under Ptolemaic rule in Asia was officially called Syria and Phoenicia, but in common usage there prevailed the unofficial COELE-SYRIA. There are several administrative districts: Namos in Asia Heptarchy. This is the Persian Medina, the primary unit. Tapas in Asia Toparchy. This was the Persian Pelech groups of villages. Each of the Ptolemaic districts formed an economic unit as well. Judea, one of the hyparchies of COELE-SYRIA, although name does not appear in the extant official documents. Samaria revolted against Alexander and burned the governor Andromachus alive. Samaria was settled by Macedonian veterans. Idumea, the capital of the hyparchy, was transferred in Hellenistic times from Lachish to Mareshah. The capital of the province of Ashdod was transferred to Jamnia. The coastal plains underwent a thorough reorganization in Ptolemaic times. A line of Sidonian kings, reestablished in the time of Alexander, came to an end in 278 BC. Tyre became a republic in 274 BC. Only Akko, that is Ptolemais, remained connected with the province of Phoenicia. Thus the Phoenician rule over the coast came to an end in the Ptolemaic period. Their former possessions became a series of autonomous cities. Then we have the Levant as part of the Seleucid kingdom. A conflict between Ptolemy and Seleucus took place, and this coalition against Antigonus Monophthalmos by Ptolemy I, Seleucus I, and Lysimachus. There were three of these kings that went against the fourth one. Palestine was to go to Seleucus I, but Ptolemy refused to hand it over after the Battle of Ipsus in 301. 4 Syrian wars were fought, 276 to 272, 260 to 255, 246 to 241, and 221 to 217. So you can see that most of the time with these rulers there was warfare. Ptolemy kept his grip on the country. Antiochus III defeated the Egyptians at Panias in 198 BC. There's a contrast between Ptolemaic and Seleucid rule, qualitative and quantitative. Ptolemies were cautious and prudent, and they were intent on consolidating their rule, preserving things as they were. The Seleucids, on the other hand, felt themselves the heirs of Alexander the Great. Their task was to unite the peoples of Asia under the aegis of Hellenistic culture. Then comes the Seleucid administration. We have difficulty in evaluating this. The administration changed rapidly. Most rely mostly on secondary sources. Confusion in the excessive use of the title strategos to designate officers of various kinds. Original meaning of strategos was officer or commander, but it stands for the viceroy ruling over half a kingdom. It's the ruler of a strategia, a province corresponding to the Persian satrapy. It's the governor of an eparchy. That's the Persian Medina, a secondary unit. It's a military commander without any civilian functions. Strategos Protarchus is a viceroy over the lands beyond the river. Strategos and Meridarchus is the ruler of a merix, the subdivision of ordinary strategia. So the term strategia was used in all of these areas, and you were never sure just where it was used properly. At times of peace, strategia was the principal unit of Seleucid administration. And this was a large unit. Its proportion to the whole Seleucid kingdom corresponded to that of a satrapy of the Persian Empire. Syria was one strategia called Seleucus. What had been the Ptolemaic territory was named COELE-SYRIA by Antiochus III. The Ptolemies had called it Syria, which sounded better. The Seleucids, however, had been the possessor of the real Syria for over a century. They added the qualifying adjective seal, the hollow, to distinguish the newly won province from their earlier possessions. Strategia of COELE-SYRIA and Phoenicia was divided into provinces called eparchia, the Persian Medina or Bahati. Strabo says that COELE-SYRIA was divided into 4 satrapies. SELUCID tended to create large-sized administrative areas. They combined several Ptolemaic hyparchies into one single eparchy. Eparchies in Palestine were 4: Samaria, Idumea, Paralia, which is the coastal plain, and Galaaditis. Now in Judea, probably retained designation of hipparchy and was subject to the authority of the eparchos residing in Samaria. This explains what happened at the beginning of the Maccabean revolt. Apollonius, the governor of Samaria, led the army of Samaria. The governor of COELE-SYRIA in person led the next contingent. As the fighting progressed, Judas was raised to the status of eparchy. The first governor, Nicanor, was twice defeated and finally killed by Judas Maccabeus. His successor, Bacchides, was a viceroy with extended powers over all Trans-Euphrates. His authority superseded a mere provincial governor. Jonathan was appointed governor of Judea in 150 BC. Jonathan was de facto an independent ruler. In Samaria, this included Galilee. Joppa may have been part of the province to supply Samaria with an outlet to the sea. Perea was attached to Samaria by Antiochus III. Idumea was enlarged by the province of Jamnia and probably included Azotus. Paralia, this is the sea coast from the ladder of Tyre to the border of Egypt. It is probable that it was only created during the Maccabean revolt in order to put the coastal cities under one government. The province was cut in two by the territories of Joppa, Jamnia, and Azotus. Galaaditis, several Ptolemaic provinces in Transjordan. The domain of the Tobiads was attached to Samaria. Now the Hasmonean kingdom. Hasmonean is another term that is used for Maccabean. And we have the historical background. For about 400 years after the return from exile, the borders of Judea remained static. Seleucid kingdom was collapsing under its own weight. There was a Roman menace since the loss of the Battle of Magnesia in 188 BC. Conflicts between descendants of Seleucus IV and Antiochus IV contributed to this unrest. Now let's talk about the Maccabean revolt. In the first 20 years, there was vigorous combat. This was between 167 and 147, and most of the fighting took place within Judea. One of the earliest conflicts took place near the city of Modein. The imperial emissary tried to persuade Mattathias to offer a sacrifice on the newly constructed pagan altar. He refused, but one of his own countrymen stepped forward to do so. Mattathias killed him and the imperial emissary. Mattathias fled with his sons into the nearby hill country of Samaria. Most of the early skirmishes between the Seleucids and Maccabean forces took place north and west of Jerusalem. The Seleucid general Apollonius sent his troops south from the city of Samaria into areas where Judas was active. The Seleucid reprisals were against pious Jewish families who took refuge in caves. When they refused to come out because it was the Sabbath, they were burned alive. After this, the policy was to fight on the Sabbath, so it would be possible to observe many Sabbaths. The following year, Mattathias died. His third son, Judas Maccabeus, became leader. Apollonius set out to engage Judas in battle. Apollonius's army was defeated and he was killed. This probably took place near Gophna. It is said that Judas took possession of Apollonius's sword and used it in all his future battles. Ptolemy, son of Dorymanes, the governor-general of COELE-SYRIA and Phoenicia, sent his army under Seron against Judas. Judas attacked him near Lower Beit Horon. Seron was killed, and his army was pursued down the Beth Horon ridge. Antiochus was busy in the east trying to fill the imperial coffers, so he left the region west of the Euphrates to the Egyptian border in the hands of his kinsman Lysias. Lysias delegated to Ptolemy the responsibility to suppress the Jewish rebellion. Ptolemy selected Nicanor, son of Patroclus, to be his commanding general, and Gorgias as his aide. Nicanor learned from his predecessor's mistakes. Apollonius had been ambushed while approaching along the northern watershed route, and Seron while ascending the Beth Horon ridge route. Nicanor made his camp near Emmaus in the plain. He was joined by merchants who hoped to profit from the slave trade of the captured Jewish fighters. Gorgias took 5,000 foot soldiers and 1,000 horsemen to fall upon Judas by night. Judas learned of the move and went to the south of Nicanor's troops at Emmaus. Judas had left fires burning in his camp and attacked Nicanor's camp at daybreak. Again, the victory went to Judas. Nicanor escaped and fled into the coastal cities of Jamnia and Azotus. When the word of the defeat at Emmaus reached Lysias, he mustered an army and marched to Idumea. Once his army was positioned on the plateau of the watershed route, Lysias began his approach towards Jerusalem and the citadel that remained besieged. Judas recognized the threat and gathered his forces to counter the advancing Seleucid army. The fortress at Beth-sur defeated the advance units of the army, and Lysias returned to Antioch to enlist mercenaries to invade Judea with a greater army. Some believe that the reason for his return to Antioch was the death of Antiochus IV rather than the defeat of his army. The Maccabees fought many battles outside of Judea to gain their independence. I believe that sufficient evidence has been shown to see that God continued to lead them to victory. The struggle for Judea came to an end in 152 BC with the appointment of Jonathan the Hasmonean as high priest and de facto ruler of the province. Process of enlargement of the boundaries of the province took place gradually. Judea was still an autonomous province in the Seleucid kingdom. Since Judea was an independent state, conquests had to be confirmed by a peace treaty with the king ceding the disputed territories. Antiochus 7 Sidetes died in 129 BC. Thenceforth, the various Seleucid kings were almost powerless in the Levant, and the country lapsed into anarchy. The latter conquests of John Hyrcanus, Judas Aristobulus I, and Alexander Jannaeus were at once incorporated into Judea by force. 147 BC, Alexander Baulus granted Acheron, that is Ekron, to Jonathan. The Hasmonean rule extended de facto over the nomes of Lydia, Harmadatha, Opharima, and the Tobiad domains beyond the Jordan. In 147 BC, Jonathan and Simeon near Jamnia decisively defeated the Syrian army led by Apollonius, the governor of COELE-SYRIA. This was a first victory over a regular force trained in the Greek manner and was won in the open plain. In 129 BC, after the death of Antiochus VII Sidetes, the dissolution of the kingdom took place. There were two Arab nations who began to expand and to encircle the Levant from the north and the south. Idureans occupied the slopes of Mount Hermon, the valley between the Hermon and Lebanon, large areas south of Damascus, and into the upper Jordan Valley and Galilee. The NABATAEANS moved northwards and westward. The HASMONEANS, that is the Maccabees, undertook territorial expansion and forced conversion of the inhabitants to Judaism. The biblical promise of Canaan to the descendants of Abraham was still regarded as valid and was taken to justify a policy of expansion. The success of the Maccabean revolt against seemingly impossible odds was taken as a sign of divine favor and of the imminent fulfillment of other prophecies. There were three tasks of the Hasmoneans: the annexation of the small nations adjoining Judea, the conquest of the Greek cities to allow access to the sea, and the driving back of the Arabs. To sum up, at the time of his death, Jannaeus ruled the whole of the coastal plain from the Kishon to the brook of Egypt, excepting Ashkelon, the whole of the mountain west of Jordan from Dan to Beersheba, almost the whole area east of the Jordan from Pontus down to Zoar and the river Zered. He had thus virtually restored the kingdom of David and Solomon. The Hasmoneans founded few cities. They had a problem with the Greek cities. Either adapt Judaism or immigrate. The necessity to secure their conquests obliged the Hasmoneans to build many fortresses. Jannaeus constructed Masada, the Alexandrium, overlooking the Jordan Valley, Hyrcania, probably Kirbit Meard, and Macarius. And then came the decline of the Hasmonean state. The successor to Alexander Jannaeus was his widow, Salome Alexandri. There was no territorial changes that occurred during her reign, but there was civil war between her two sons, Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II. Hyrcanus ceded 12 cities in Moab to Aretas III, king of the NABATAEANS, in return for help against Aristobulus. These included cities taken by Janneus and Medeba, which had been taken by Hyrcanus I over 60 years before. Pompey, after defeating King Mithridates of Pontus, led the Roman army into Syria. He invited the two Hasmonean brothers to submit their differences to him at Damascus. He decided to support Hyrcanus II and invaded Judea by way of Corbury in the Jordan Valley. He took Aristobulus prisoner at Alexandrium and proceeded to Jerusalem. The city opened its gates, but the temple resisted for 4 months. Judea had lost its independence.